A great host. Show is great. Listen to his show.
Absolutely, 95.5.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, it's the Shelley Winter Show live, local, topical, and we're going to have a good night tonight. And so what I was doing right now is I was looking for what I was looking for. I tell you, the best part of doing this show, honestly, my friends, are my coworkers. And I tell you, being able to talk to Eric Von Hesser as he does show prep. I'm usually here. I'm starting my show prep, and I talk to him during his show, during his breaks, but especially at the end when he's getting off. And it really is inspiring, and I truly appreciate him very, very, very much. So I got a lot to talk about. At 7:36, we have attorney Alan Lightcap. He's representing Stephen Hughes. Stephen Hughes is the man who is suing in Gwinnett County Superior Court about the city of Mulberry in northeastern Gwinnett County. He's suing the county's election board and the election supervisor, seeking to stop the cityhood referendum. So he joins us at 7:36 to talk about that lawsuit. Very big local story about new cities popping up. So we're going to have that conversation at 7:36. I wanted to start. So we had a lot else to talk. We had a lot more to talk about. We'll get to that. What's on a Fulton County official Republican ballot, May 21st. You got. Wait till you hear this story. Oh my God! Wait till you hear this. But anyway, got a lot to talk about. So let's start here. So earlier, I came across this story. It's an article. It's an opinion piece by Jonah Goldberg. Jonah Goldberg. He's as neocon as you can get. I mean, he is a wherever the military-industrial complex wants you to go, he will write the stories and the books for you to go there. Right? That's who he is. Right? So he wrote a piece, what we keep getting wrong about protests like those at USC, Columbia, and other campuses. So I want to read the first part to you. The current campus demonstrations are a reminder that all of the mossy cliches and puffed-up pieties of polite and impolite American discourse, the sanctity of protest is the hardest to question. Doubting the loftiness of protest invites elite scorn more than any other skepticism about a constitutional right. Proposing limits on free speech, for example, attracts far less outrage. Attracts far less outrage. Indeed, people question free speech all the time in debates about hate speech, campaign finance, social media, and more. But if I say that most protests are performative cosplay or mass meetups of the angry, the radical, and the lonely, or the misinformed, someone is bound to point to the civil rights protests of the 1960s or campaign for women's suffrage, followed by a string of righteous how dare yous. This gets to the part of my objection. There's nothing inherently good or bad about protesting. Organized protest is a form of speech, and like speech, it is rightly protected by the First Amendment. But also like speech, its morality, though not its legality, is wholly dependent on the content. And this is what I've been trying to explain to you guys over the last several days. That statement right there. But also like speech, its morality, though not its legality, is wholly dependent on the content. I fundamentally disagree with that statement. But he continues, you have a right to say or protest for awful things. Invoking that right doesn't make your view any nobler. So he goes on. This is the part really where I find very interesting. The Jim Crow-era civil rights protests were noble because the cause was noble. They did not prove that protesting is always good, merely that it can be. Replace the March on Washington with the Nazi March on Skokie, Illinois, and you get the point. Wow, let's get to this. So, now, the right in 2024 sees the civil rights protests of the 60s as a noble cause. However, that has always not been the case. I'm going to read to you the first paragraph in Civil Rights, Electric Charges. The plan as proposed reaches. This is Time Magazine, March 26, 1965. The plan as proposed reaches to the outer limits of what is constitutionally allowed. However, the wrongs and injustices inflicted upon these plaintiffs have clearly exceeded and continue to exceed the outer limits of what is constitutionally permissible. The extent of the right to assemble, demonstrate, and march should be commensurate with the enormity of the wrongs that are being protected and petitioned against. In this case, the wrongs are enormous. That was Federal District Judge Frank Johnson. And when he wrote that, it was about the Selma 50-mile march. George Wallace, he tried to appeal for a stay. He was turned down flat. He went before the Alabama legislature, and for 20 minutes of bombast, the proposed march, he declared, was communist-inspired, abetted by a collectivist press and by propagandists masquerading as newsmen. He delivered a withering blast against his old university friend, a University of Alabama friend, Judge Johnson, who is, quote, hypocritically wearing the robes of a judge while presiding over a mock court, one who prostitutes our law in favor of mob rule. Does any of that sound familiar? Outside payments to these protesters, mob rule, breaking the law. These are all the things you guys have been saying to me. And I have simply been trying to say against the argument of Jonah Goldberg, who says that also, like speech, it's morality. When you say it's morality, meaning if I'm against it, then it shouldn't happen. Though not its legality, of course it's legal, but if I'm against it morally, it shouldn't happen. It's wholly dependent on the content. That's not true. Let me tell you, let's go back to these polls back in the day, because everyone now sees the civil rights cause as a noble cause. Everyone sits back and looks at the civil rights cause. Oh, of course, this was all right. Oh, everyone knows it was the righteous thing to do. But back when it was going on, polling showed a lot of people didn't like it. This is Gallup. This is 1961. Gallup organization. Do you think sit-ins at lunch counters, freedom buses, and the demonstration by Negroes will hurt or help the Negroes' chances of being integrated in the South? 57% said hurt. 28% said help. 16% had no opinion. That's 1961. Do you think sit-ins at lunch counters, freedom buses, and other demonstrations by Negroes will hurt or help the Negroes' chances of being integrated in the South? 57, nearly 60% of the people polled by Gallup in 1961 said it would hurt their chances to sit in or ride freedom buses. What are your feelings about this proposed march, mass civil rights rally to be held in Washington? This is August 28th, 1963. 23% favorable. Yes, this is my feelings. It's favorable. 35% generally unfavorable. 7% unfavorable, predicting violence. And 18% unfavorable, won't accomplish anything. That means 35 and 7 is 42, and 18 is 60% of Americans in 1963, right before the March on Washington, saw the march as unfavorable. 7% thought it would have turned into violence. So when you talk about the moral content 70 years later, or 50 years later, almost 60 years later, yeah, it's easy to say, yeah, well, civil rights movement and the civil rights protests were morally right. That was a noble cause. But back then, they didn't see it as a noble cause. Back then, they saw it the way you see the college protests right now. Do you think this is Gallup, 1964. Do you think mass demonstrations by Negroes are more likely to help or more likely to hurt the Negroes' cause for racial inequality? This question says racial equality, not integration in the South. 16% said help. 74% said hurt. That mass demonstrations by Negroes are more likely to hurt the Negroes' cause for racial equality. And remember, these people were nonviolent. By definition, they were trained and they were nonviolent. One interesting thing that I read doing my research for this opening segment was that when the media, when there was a violent protest, even if the violent protest was in self-defense, because remember, these were nonviolent protesters, they practiced nonviolence. That was the whole idea. That when they were put upon by the police, like is going on now that we talked about last night, when they were put upon by the police, the national consciousness saw it as bad. In Selma, when they marched across the bridge, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and state troopers on horses with billy clubs and tear gas beat these protesters coming across the bridge, the United States, as a country, rallied and said, we must pass Civil Rights Act. Why? Because of the violence. I've simply been trying to explain to you what I just saw through Jonah Goldberg, is that there is no moral content to the protest. It is the protest that's the morality. no matter what the people are protesting, whether civil rights, ceasefire, release the hostages, pro-Israel, whatever it is they're protesting, the protest is the protest. As soon as you send in authorities, as soon as you send in the police, as soon as you send in riot gear, as soon as you send in tear gas, as soon as you send in billy clubs, you have lost the moral high ground, as illustrated by all of these polls. America thought demonstrations were bad in the 60s. Yet the protests continued, and the legislation was passed, largely after the violence came from the state. Stop making these kids argument for them by cheering for tear gas and billy clubs. Let them yell, let them scream, and leave them alone. You're making their case for an authoritarian fascist state when you cheer for the police running in there. Shelley Winter Show. We'll be right back. 404-872-0750. 1-800-WSB-TALK.